So one thing that I get asked about a decent amount is hip impingement. And so today I want to go through a specific example that we've handled, or that I've handled in terms of impingement of the hip and just what we did there. So this specific case, Ben, he had hip pain. I've been having feedback for a while. First goal that we wanted to, or that I wanted to do after kind of taking in his information on his initial call, was lots of accessory work so he could remember what it was like to not have pain there again. So basically with him, anything like in deep flexion, anything with kind of like some internal rotation of the hip, it would get pinchy and he'd feel like it just wouldn't feel good there. And then he also had something where like it'd kind of grab or feel like it was rolling over when he pulled up into flexion. So he'd been having that for quite a while. So what we wanted to do was allow him to be able to work for a period of time where he didn't actually have that feedback. Because what can happen is, let's say you've been going 2 years and you've had that feedback in the hip, or you've had that feedback wherever else. Like if every time that I take my hip and I move it here, I'm like, oh, pain, 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 pain. That starts to like, you start to just expect that every time I do that, there's gonna be pain, pain, pain. And then you start to look for it, like testing it 50 times a day, walking around like, is there pain? Is there pain, right? I think we've all been there and we've all experienced that. So the first goal was, hey, let's take that, let's not do that. Seems like a good idea. Let's not do that. And show some examples of what we were specifically doing for that. But I was like, let's not do that. So basically we're gonna do different type of accessory work, a lot of that with not much output. So this is one example. This would be very light impulses, is almost like an impulse into a light overcoming ISO. So you can see we did flexion, internal external rotation, this is adduction, then we also did abduction. So basically he's up into the impulse, lightly pulling in, back down, up into the impulse, lightly pulling in, back down. This is just one example of that. Like we also use joint moves, joint holds, high rep band type stuff with the hips. So a lot of different variations of it, but the general concept was, again, get him to be able to use and move this area without getting the feedback, so that he could then remember what it was like to actually be able to do that. And these are some, just from one day, some practical examples. This was, that was on 10/7, so October 7th of 2024, he started on the 5th. So that was an example of like an early on what we did for some hip stuff. We were also still hitting like hamstring, quad, feet. We were hitting all that, but that's specifically some stuff that we did for the hip. So that was kind of like initial, I would say 1, 2, maybe 2.5 weeks. You can see here on 10/15, so this would be what, like 8 days after the 7th. Load while staying out of ranges that bugged him. So we're continuing to go on that trend. But you can see here that we started to add in a little bit of load about 1.5 to 2 weeks in, where he's going, I think he had like 455 on some box squats, but we're just not going deep in range because it doesn't bug him. Then even in his depth drops, we're not going super deep, so that doesn't bug him, because that doesn't bug him as well. So we're still continuing to do that accessory work, like high volumes of the accessory work, but we're also starting to add in this a little bit, because once you do 1 to 2 weeks of that accessory work, a lot of times we need to add in some different type of stimulus. Like think about initially when we started him with this, it is a drastic change in stimulus, right? He'd been doing a lot of output work, he'd been doing a lot of like the squats and a lot of that stuff, a lot of the sprints, a lot of the jumps. We take that out, that's a massive change of stimulus for him. We introduce something new, and now we do that for a week or two, and now we start to bring in that other stuff, which is another change in stimulus, right? But that initial change in stimulus is like, let's use the hip where you don't get the feedback. And then the body's like, oh, okay, this is what we want to do. And then we introduce back in some of that other higher output type of stuff, but now we're doing it in ranges where it doesn't give that feedback yet, right? So we're not necessarily going full on with it. We're regressing a little bit, but he's still going with pretty good intensity on it. So that was kind of basically what we moved into next. Then we see here 10/29, we started loading and sprinting. Hip wasn't feeling great. So I think I have the same. Yeah, so this is some feedback on a specific day that he had. We'd done sprinting before this. He goes, feeling it in hip a bit at this point. Isos were solid, but felt limited range of motion. Only 95 and 115 for launch sets. His Achilles, hip, foot, etc. were not ready. And then he said hip is not liking all this. Yeah, so I had him doing rebound rep lunges. You can see he's doing a little bit of hold at the end. Just wasn't quite ready for it yet. And this is like this, just completely transparent. Like this happens sometimes as we're going through a rehab process, and I think it's important to bring up, because a lot of times what will happen is like, if we're going through rehab and you get some type of feedback or sensation, you're like, oh, that must mean something's bad or terrible. It must mean that I need to go get it checked out or whatever. It's not necessarily the case. It just means that we may, like, we're asking your body what it's ready to do, and it's telling us, like, hey, we're not quite ready to do that yet. And so this may absolutely happen as we're going through the process. That was on 10/29, which was about 24 days after we initially started. So we were trying to fully reintroduce the sprinting and jumping and stuff. Didn't really like it. Next one we have is 10/31. Found a hip move that worked well and body responded well to. I remember this one. It was a lion hip flexor pull. So we've done a bunch of different impulse variations before in different hip moves. Really seemed to like this one, and body really responded well to this one. So we started to use that one, integrate that one quite a bit. And then later on we have 11/15, so this would be about 15 days later. An example of a secondary session. Main session is mostly full goal at this point, continued bias in secondary. So this would be, what, 11/15 would be a little over a month, like a month and a week after we first started. And the example is here. So this is an example of a secondary session. So basically at this point it was, we kind of took care, we took and we handled what he was experiencing when we were doing those high effort sprints, the rebound rep lunges, that type of stuff. We kind of got in and handled that and figured it out. So at this point the main sessions were mostly, we were able to integrate and do that stuff, and then we're still biasing the hip in the secondary session. So specifically on this day, this is just one example. We start with some exploration work for the upper half, and then after that we finish with some specifics. So lateral hip raises, 30 seconds per set, torso stand straight up and down, pulling to the cleanest range as you can, along with medial leg impulses as we're overcoming iso, because he specifically said that those were something that he felt like we needed to work on that really hit that spot well. So main sessions full go, secondary sessions still biasing that hip, and this is, like I said, about a month and a week after. And this is something that he'd been dealing with for a long period of time. We were able to address it pretty well here, fairly quickly. And then 12/13, back into high output work fully. So this is just an example of jumps there, but we were able to go fully into the high output work there, and that was what, just over 2 months? Yeah, just over 2 months post. Has been successful in keeping it since being done. Which he just responded to. Someone asked in a recent Q&A, have you had success in the past where having hip impingement? So that was his response to that, where it's like, which is cool because he's done training at this point, but it's still continued to stick for him. Like, I think he's been done for maybe a month and a half now, somewhere around there, and has been able to, because the big thing for him too was he wanted to be able to learn what it was that he needed to be able to do to kind of support himself as he brought in the full, like the high output work back into his sessions in full. He's like, do I really have to do all this hip work, all this accessory hip work in order to keep this thing feeling good? And the basic idea is, like, obviously there's going to be more of it. Like at the start of this process, we heavily bias that accessory work. But if the goal is to be able to continue that high output work, like let's say we have a squat and that squat has a certain amount of stimulus attached to it, which is very high because of the intensity. Hip work, just by design, because it's only like one thing, is going to be a little bit lower in its intensity. So the volume has to be higher. So it's like, it didn't have to be as high as when we first started to kind of keep that all healthy. But at the same time, we still need to be able to get in a similar level of stimulus to those different kind of smaller areas as we do when we're doing those global high output moves, to be able to maintain and actually like improve those areas so that it doesn't just fall back into what it was before. Because that's what can happen. Is like, we bias it heavy, we get it feeling good, and then you go back to like exactly what you're doing before, and then it just comes back. Well, it's like, yeah, makes sense, right? So we want to make adjustments, and he's been able to make those adjustments and stick really well to keep himself feeling good and feeling healthy.